I am going to share today a talk about the book that I published recently called The Story Habit, which, if you were at the event last week, you saw I gave away several copies. So as a quick introduction, yes, my name is Jamie. I've been in China for 16 years, originally from the UK. The most interesting thing about me is my Chinese name. My Chinese name, 有没有人猜我中文名叫什么？杰米，哪个杰？杰出的杰，哪个米？杰出的大米。If you translate it into English, it's outstanding rice. So hopefully that is easy to remember. So I am the author of The Story Habit, which is a book I published only a month ago now. And this book is about storytelling, but it's not just about how to tell stories. There is a much bigger application to storytelling than just telling stories. And that is what I'm going to introduce to you today. And when we think of the word story, we tend to think of people telling stories. We tend to think of books, of movies, and so on. But there is a much deeper meaning. Let me give you an example. What do you see when you look at this picture here? You see red. What else do people see?
Flowers.
You see flowers.
Mosaic.
Mosaic. You see moving lights. Everyone sees something different. Now, you see a face. Okay. You see a hand. Everyone sees something different. But now I'm going to put a story into your mind that is going to affect how you look at this picture. And very simply, it is this. What is this? It's a zebra. The most interesting thing is what happens when I take away the picture of the zebra. The zebra is now in your brain. And as you look at this picture, you cannot unsee the zebra. I have installed the zebra in your brain. This is what we really mean by storytelling. And this is actually, there's a name for this phenomenon or this theory. It's called the theory of simulation. And the idea is that what we see around us is actually not what is around us. It's actually what our brain thinks is around us. And an example is if you walk into a room and you see someone sitting on the sofa and you say, hello, and then you notice actually it's a coat and a bag and there's no person there. Your brain has projected that story over what you've seen. And another more common example is sometimes you have songs going around in your brain and you hear the song in your brain, but you don't hear what is around you. And so this is what we really mean when we talk about storytelling. We don't see the world as it is. We see the world as we think it is. We see the world as our stories tell us it is. And so this is now not working.
Yeah, it's working now.
There we go. And so to me, the real meaning of story is it's a layer of meaning between our brains and reality. The real world is very, very, very complicated. You think of where you are sitting right now, there is a lot of noise around you. There are all of the different people. There are all of the different feelings, the feeling of your clothes, of the chair, the noise of the air conditioning, even the noise of the traffic outside, all sorts of smells and so on. But most of these don't go into your brain. Your brain uses stories to filter through the noise and focus on what is most important. And to really show how this works, I have a little story for you. Imagine that since you were a child, from the day you were born, you lived your whole life in this little village. And this village has absolutely everything that you need. It has a stream with all of the water that you need. It has a farm that produces vegetables. One family raises chickens, another cows, another pigs, so you have all of the food you need. Another family makes clothing, so you have everything that you need in this small little village. And surrounding this village is a forest. And this forest is so dense with trees that people call it the dark forest. And nothing good happens in the dark forest. The elderly people in the village have a lot of stories about the dark forest. They say that if you go in there, you will be eaten by dragons, or you will be picked up by giant eagles and taken away. And so you have never, ever wanted to go into that dark forest. Every morning when you wake up, you pray to the village to protect you for another day. Every evening when you go to bed, you thank the village for protecting you another day. And every time it's someone's birthday, you celebrate by thanking the village for protecting them another year. When you were a child, a friend of yours named Try went into the dark forest. He was very, very curious. He never returned, and his parents cried for many, many months. So you've lived a safe, stable, and happy life in this village all throughout your life until today, when all of a sudden a man walks out of the forest into the village and says, "My name is Try. 30 years ago, when I was a child, I walked into this dark forest and I got lost and I couldn't find my way back home. But finally, I have found my way back home. And now I've come back to tell you about all of the wonders I discovered in the big wide world out there and invite you to come with me through the dark forest to see the beautiful world." My story ends here. And normally when I am running workshops, I ask people to think, if you were Try, how would you persuade these villagers to go with you out into the dark forest? I'm going to share with you how in a moment. There's another question as well. This is a metaphor, and the village and the dark forest both represent different things. So coming back to the real world and the workplace, the village represents people's comfort zones, and the dark forest represents uncertainty and the unknown. And when we are trying to persuade people, when we are trying to change people's minds, to influence people, what we are really trying to do is ask them to leave their comfort zone and go in to the unknown. And recently, I have worked with a lot of China leadership teams who are facing this problem. In China, their Chinese competitors are getting faster, they're producing higher quality, they're providing better service, and they're doing things cheaper. And so they go to their leadership teams in Europe or the US, and they say, we need to change things here in China. But, and I won't go into politics, but we know that in Europe, the US, and other parts of the world, people have a lot of stories about China right now. And those stories are having a big influence on their decision-making. And so the leadership teams that I'm working with right now, they are having to find ways of influencing through and around the stories that people believe in right now. So how can we do this exactly? Well, as I was researching my book, The Story Habit, it took me about three years roughly to create The Story Habit. I discovered that telling stories and influencing the stories people believe in works in exactly the same way. And there are three words: relate, challenge, resolve. And if you only remember one thing from my presentation today, make it this: relate, challenge, resolve. Any story that you ever hear or read or see will always start by introducing you to a character that you can relate to, in a situation that you can relate to. Then they meet a challenge, and that challenge creates pain. And because they meet a challenge, they want to find a resolution. They want to find a solution for this. Now, in Chinese, challenge and resolve are very easy to translate, 挑战 and 解决. Relate is a bit harder to translate, I have found. The closest word is 产生共鸣, but I don't think that is the exact word. Relate is a very, very specific term, and it's a very important thing to do when you are telling stories. Now, we can also use relate, challenge, resolve to influence the stories people believe in. If we were to go to these villages, and as I explain this, perhaps think about the people in your life that you need to influence and persuade. Maybe your mother-in-law, maybe your boss, maybe a customer, maybe a supplier. If you want to persuade them, what a lot of people naturally do is they go straight to challenging. And they say, you're wrong, I'm right. Here are all of the reasons you're wrong, and here are all of the reasons I'm right. But what we really need to do is we start with relating. We need to step into their village, and we need to learn the stories that they believe in. We need to spend a lot of time listening to them, asking them questions, learning what is important to them and what they care about. And when we start talking, and this is a little tip for any presentation that you ever give, if you want to start your presentation effectively, start by relating. And the way to start by relating is to say things that make people go, oh, you're dull. Oh, make them nod their heads. When they're nodding their heads, that's a sign you are relating to them. And when you relate enough, then you can go to challenge. And you can start pointing out, you're wrong, I'm right, and this is why. And because you are relating to them, they will be more likely to accept your challenge. And challenging is all about changing their minds. It's about making them believe this isn't a dark forest, it's just a forest. But it's not enough to get them to take action. That's where the resolve part comes in. And resolve is about inspiring them to simply take that first step. And a really important principle for behavior change is that it's easier to continue doing something than it is to start doing something. I give an example. When I'm watching a movie with my wife on the sofa, she will tell me to, Jamie, could you get the remote control for me? I'm like, oh, fine. I get the remote control. Once I get the remote control, then she'll say, oh, and there's another thing in the bedroom over there. Could you go and get that? It's easier to continue than it is to start. If you make people start, you'll find it easier to get them to continue. So let's do a little deep dive, and I'll do a deep dive for the rest of my presentation, and I'll try to keep it to time. Starting with an example for story. What is this movie? Oh, okay, you can see it. It's Frozen. Frozen is actually one of the most successful movies of all time. And it's one of the most annoying movies of all time, because in your head, and just as I was saying earlier about the theory of simulation, now you're not listening to me, you're listening to let it go in your brains. And the reason it was such a successful movie was because it related so well to its audience. And its audience were preschoolers, so children of my age, about 3 to 6 years old. The way it related to them, first of all, it had a character, Ilsa, who had a power that she could not control. And if you have young children, you will know their emotions, they cannot control. They have zero control over their emotions. So seeing someone with something they can't control, they can relate to that. Also, it's a fantasy land where snowmen can talk and magic happens. And young children, they don't live in the real world, they live in a fantasy world. When I walk to the supermarket from my apartment, it takes 5 minutes. But with my son, it takes 45 minutes, because on the way, we're running away from sharks and we're fighting monsters. And then he's Automan and I'm a monster. And then I'm Automan and he's a monster. And his imagination just never stops. And another thing, another way that this movie related was the strong sense of family bonds. And to a young child, family is everything. It's everything they have. And so if you look at any Disney movie, I think Disney is a fantastic example because pretty much all of their movies are very successful. And they're successful because they do such a good job of relating to their audience. Now, coming to the way of shaping the stories people believe in, really interesting example. Some of you might have seen this video from a few years ago. This was a Thai police officer sitting in his police station when a man walked in with a knife and said, "I'm going to kill you." Now, perhaps if this had happened in America, they would have got guns out and grenades and explosions. But this police officer, his name was Anarat Mali, he took a different approach. He started to relate to the man, and he started by speaking in the same dialect. He asked how he could help the man. He sat down, and you can see here, he's sitting down on the desk. Rather than standing up and looking down, he sat down to be on the same level. And he hugged the man when he gave up his knife. And he later on found out that this man had just had a very bad few days. He worked as a security guard, but he had not got paid for his job. And he loved playing guitar, but someone stole his guitar. And so he just went past his point of no return and threatened to kill him. And he was very lucky to come across Anarat Mali. And Anarat Mali summarizes by saying, when someone helps us, listens to us, and assures us we're touched by that person. And so this is relating and how we can use relating to influence people. And relating is all about learning their stories and reflecting their stories. And I believe people's stories are made up of their experiences, their beliefs, and their motivations. And when we don't relate to their stories, this creates disinterest. And at worst, it creates conflict. But when we relate, they're interested in what we have to say, and we build a connection with them. For the second part, challenge. A really good example is this movie, The Matrix. I think. And this is a fantastic metaphor, actually, for how stories work. Because the story starts by introducing us to Neo. And Neo is just like us. He has his regular 9-to-5 job. He lives in the real world. We all live in the real world. At least we think we live in the real world. And that's how his world works. And a really important part of any story is learning the stories the character believes in, because then the world will change. And as the world changes, their stories are out of date. And Neo discovers this is not the real world. Strange things are happening in this world. And as he discovers this is not the new world, he has to update his stories, and he has to align his way of thinking with this new reality he's found. And a really important principle here is that story is always about change. It's never about, I got on the subway, I went to work, I got on the subway, I went home, I went to bed. It's always about, I got on the subway and then there was a flood, and then there were sharks in the subway, and they had lasers, and it's always something different, something changed. And when there is a change, there is a story. And the change creates a challenge, and that's what makes the story interesting. Coming back to shaping the stories people believe in, Airbnb, I think, is a fantastic example, because before Airbnb, if you wanted to go traveling, you stayed in a hotel. That's the story you had. You go traveling, you stay in a hotel. That's the way things work. And then Airbnb comes along and says, no, you don't have to stay in a hotel. You can stay in a stranger's house. What? And it worked. They came along and they challenged our stories. They pointed out the flaws in the current story. If you stay in a hotel, you don't get the local experience. And it's always expensive, and it's always the same thing. But if you stay in a stranger's house, then you get the local immersion. You get a greater variety, and you get to choose the price that fits your budget. And they were so effective at challenging people's stories that they became a huge success. And so challenging is all about pointing out, the story you have right now is not helping you. And I have a better story that's going to help you a lot more. That is what challenging stories is all about. And if you want to change people's minds, that is what you need to do. The final part is resolve. And this is the part that most people don't pay enough attention to. And it's actually my favorite part. This is the part all about inspiring people. And a very, very good example. This book, Uncle Tom's Cabin. Has anyone heard of this book before? Yeah. Okay, I find normally there's a few people in the audience who know about it. I only learned about this earlier this year. This is the story of a slave in the US about almost 200 years ago now. It was actually the best-selling book of the 19th century, just behind the Bible. And the reason this is such a good example is because it's a story that influenced people so much, it changed history. This story was about a slave called Uncle Tom. And his owner was, as far as slave owners go, was okay. Not that slave owners are okay, but as far as slave owners go, he was okay. He wasn't too bad to Tom. And Tom had a wife and he had kids, and this was his life. And he was looking forward to freedom. But then his owner had financial troubles and had to sell Tom to resolve his financial troubles. Tom got sold to a bad slave owner who beat him and tortured him and separated him from his wife and his children and took away his dream of freedom. And as you read this kind of story, you have empathy for the character. And that helps you feel the pain that that character goes through. And that influences you. And so as people were reading this book, at first, there were only a few people in the population who were anti-slavery. But then, as more people read this book, more and more and more and more people thought, no, slavery has got to stop. And this led to the election of Abraham Lincoln, led to the Civil War, and eventually the end of slavery. And it did this by helping more people empathize with the experience of being a slave and giving them a powerful reason to end slavery. Now, what it really inspired people to do was one very simple action. When it was time to vote, tick here. Was one simple action, tick, and you will change history. That is the key to inspiring, in my opinion. Make the action so easy and have such a low cost and such a high benefit that it's almost inevitable that they just tick, they just do it. Now, coming to shaping stories, I love this example. Online services. We don't really think of this, but they're fantastic at inspiring us to take action because they depend on web pages to sell their services. They don't depend on people to sell their services. So they design a process to inspire people to take one step, click. That's all they're inspiring you to do. And they do this by minimizing the cost of the action. You go on the web page and it's bright, it's directly in front of you, and it says, click here, and everything is pointing you to this one little button. And they remove risk. When you click here, you're paying money. What if I pay money and I don't like it? Well, there is an escape plan. I can cancel anytime. I can take a free trial. So now there's no risk. It's not complicated, so there's no cost. And I get all of these free movies, all these free services, so there's a high benefit. All right, click. So I may as well. And that's what it is. They increase the benefit, they reduce the cost, and you click the button and you pay your money. And that's how they inspire people to take action. And resolving is really about this. When it comes to change, think of change as a journey. And there is a destination. For example, maybe you want to lose weight, and the destination is I will lose 20 kilograms or whatever. there's also a way, a path to the destination. To lose weight, I must do exercise and I must go on a diet. And everyone talks about the destination. Everyone talks about the path, but what no one talks about is the next step. We all know that if we want to be healthy, we need to exercise and we need to eat right. But the reason we might not do it is because we don't know what the next step is. How do I find an exercise that works for me? How do I find a diet and a way of eating that works for me? That is the critical next step. And that is what you need to focus on if you want to inspire people to action. And so just to finish up here, the reason I call my book The Story Habit is because relating, challenging, and resolving, I list as individual skill sets. And for each skill set, I've listed a number of habits. There are 16 habits. So there are some habits here for relating, habits for challenging, and habits for resolving. But my favorite habit is this habit for telling stories. Notice change, because a story is always about change, as I mentioned earlier. And if you want to become a good storyteller, it's actually a lot simpler than you might think. All you need to do is pay attention to the changes that happen in your life every single day. When those happen, you remember them and you store them in what we call your story pool. Your story pool is a memory bank of all of these stories. And then the next time you have an opportunity to explain something, to persuade someone, to inspire someone, you can take out that story and tell it. The very first time you tell a story, it is rubbish. That is the way it is. But as you tell it, you notice the audience's feedback. And then you go, I shouldn't tell that part next time. And next time I should change this bit. And then you try it again. And then you try it again. And then you try it again. Think of any comedian who's standing on stage in front of an audience of thousands who've all paid a lot of money for their show. When they are telling their stories, they have the whole audience hooked. That is not the first time they've told those stories. They've told those stories hundreds and hundreds of times before and refined them and improved them until finally they have the story that hooks people. And so if you want to become a good storyteller, it all starts with just noticing change, noticing the changes that happen in your day-to-day life, building a story pool, taking those stories out and practicing them, and then refining them. And then gradually you'll become a really, really good storyteller. It's actually really, really easy. And just as a little upsell, I do a lot of training workshops on this. I also have a licensing program, which will be starting soon. So anyone interested in becoming a story habit coach or trainer, you can feel free to reach out to me. And if you want to keep in touch, here are my contact details. I'm not sure if I went over time or under time, but the end. Great. Thank you very much. Thank you.